Hey guys, nice to see you guys again. Glad that you're tuning in and watching these talks with us. Again, I'm Noah Lowerton, Young Life Leader here at Radford. Have been for about 4 or 5 years. Work part-time with them, just been involved that way. What we've been doing this semester is we've been talking through the story of Jesus, authored by God, that is revealed to us in the Bible. So we've been talking about creation and Jesus coming to earth and just his life mostly at this point. We've been covering his ministry that he's had and his time on earth that we have recorded in history. And so what we're going to continue to do, we're going to continue to talk about his story. So essentially Jesus explodes on the scene. We've seen him, so his birth in the book of Luke, and we see him arriving as the promised one that we talked about through Abraham and David in the Old Testament. And so Jesus shows up and he's calling people and he's saying that he is king. He's saying that the kingdom of God is here. And one of the first things that he does is he calls disciples. And disciples are just people who follow him closely. They're followers of him. They recognize that he is who he says he is, and so they follow him closely. And he calls these guys in a myriad of different ways. One of the main ways that we see is there's at least 4 of them that are fishermen. I know it's back when being on the shores of Capernaum where they were from, fishing is a huge industry for these guys. So he went out and he called 4 guys, James, John, Peter, and Andrew. And he's calling these 4 guys, and they're fishermen, they're having a rough day out on the boat. So Jesus walks up to the shore and he calls them by name, tells them to throw the net on the other side. They do, and Jesus causes fish to fill the nets until they're about to break. So they believe that he is who he says he is, and they come and they follow him. They follow him closely. And Peter, his name wasn't Peter at first, it was Simon. And so he changes his name to Peter. He says, changing his name to Peter, or Cephas in Aramaic, which means rock. He says, because you're going to be the rock that my church is founded on. So he changes Peter's name, and Peter's really his right-hand man through a lot of the ministry that we see. See, everywhere that Jesus goes, usually in the Gospels, Peter's right there. He's following alongside, and he is, in very typical Peter fashion, being headstrong, very vocal, even when he's wrong, at least thinking that he's right. And that's just Peter's tendency. He's brash and he's impulsive, but he's at the right hand of Jesus the entire time. He's there watching Jesus exorcise demons and raise people from the dead and cure disease and sickness. At some point, Jesus even gives him the ability to do that. And so Peter's alongside. He witnesses all of this. He's following alongside of Jesus, and he is right there. He gets a front row seat to everything that's happening, everything that we've talked about. He is right there at the beginning. And so what we're going to talk about today is a lot of Jesus and Peter's relationship really summed up in this passage right here. So we're going to be in Matthew 14. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from the land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. Pretty understandable if you see somebody walking on water in a misty setting. Seems like a pretty terrifying, pretty proper response to have, if you ask me. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." "Lord, if it is you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." Typical Peter says, "Okay, I don't know. How about you tell me to do something? Do what I'm saying." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and he began to sink. And he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. And those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." When they crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret. When the men of that place recognized Jesus, they sent word to all the surrounding country. People brought their sick to him, begged him to let the sick just touch the edge of his cloak, and all who touch it were healed. So one of the first things that we see is Peter's response to Jesus saying, walk out on the water. And it just reminds me a lot of how relatable Peter is, right? So Peter has been following alongside of Jesus this entire time, front row seats. So you would think, yeah, walking out on this water is going to be no problem. He follows him, he believes him, he knows who he is. He has this relationship with him. So Peter takes some steps out on the water, and yet the wind and the waves are distracting. They're taking his eyes off of what Jesus is doing and who Jesus is. So Peter begins to sink. He begins to fall. So Jesus grabs him and says, you of little faith, why did you doubt? And that's where Peter's really relatable, because even though he had seen everything that Jesus did in his ministry, in his life, the way he lived, he still doubted. He still messed up. He still fell short. It reminds me of when I was a kid, following my dad in pretty much anything that we ever did. And I remember being at Reed Mountain Pool, one of the most average pool I've ever been to. And I'm sitting there, and I'm really a little kid, and my mom tells me this story about how he was trying to show me how to dive off a diving board. I wasn't that little, he dives off, and then I'm supposed to go right after him. And it's something as simple as, is it the pencil? You literally just stand straight up, and you just jump in. Very simple. Start there, you just keep going, and then you get really good at eventually different types of dives and things like that. So he just goes ahead of me, and he just jumps right in. And we repeat this. I watch him do it. I watch my older sisters do it. I watch other kids do it. I'm like, all right, this makes sense. Especially seeing my dad do it. I trust him. I know him. I'm like, yeah, this is pretty simple. I've known this guy for a while. I've seen him do this before. I should be able to do this. And I walk up on the board. I remember this as a kid. And didn't slip. There was no water that caused me to fail. But I literally just walked out to the edge of this board. Again, didn't slip. This is me as a kid, for some reason thinking I'm just going to fall off of it sideways. And so instead of walking off and just jumping like a normal person, I just kind of walked to the front corner of the diving board and just leaned sideways. And as you probably know, that is not the way that you're supposed to do that. It hurt pretty badly. I ended up catching the side of the diving board and then kind of catching the concrete a little bit because it's not that big of a diving board. And then just kind of spiraling and falling into the water chaotically. It all goes wrong. It's just poor in that moment. So those kind of childlike moments are ones that remind me of Peter in this situation where he knows, he believes in Jesus, he trusts Jesus, but in this moment he fell short. And he looked for answers where there were none. And he tried to accomplish something without focusing on Jesus, and he fell short on that. And that's where Peter's really relatable, and that's what a lot of this passage shows us, is that what Peter's really showing us is what it's like to be human. What it means to be a human in a hard reality is failing. Failing pretty hard at times. These are things that we just do inevitably. There are plenty of situations in life where we are inevitably going to fail because there's expectations from people and ourselves in ways that things should go, and there's standards of success, and those all exist. But so inevitably we fall short of these. And this is what Peter's showing us what it's like to be a human. Even when we think we're doing everything right, inevitably there will be a time when we fall short. And this happens in our own lives every day. I think of a big example for me is sports. Sports are something I grew up around all the time. They were a big deal in my life. So for me, I was a big track guy. There's not a lot of big track people, which is fair, because it's pretty boring to watch a track meet all day. I'll give you that credit. But it's like the first sport, so don't tell me it's not a sport. But I was a track athlete for a really long time. So essentially what happened is we get to my senior year. I'm competed all 4 years. This is my thing. I've put my time and effort and my life into this. And I'm ranked number 1 in the state senior year going into this track meet. And everybody's there, family's there, we got some friends there, teammates there, even opponents who I kind of become friends with. They're all there. Like, there's an expectation, they do the school announcements before people leave, and they're like, oh, this person's going to go, and hopefully they win, congrats, So I go, and I don't have a terrible day. I just have an average one. I just do okay for what I know that I could do, maybe a little bit below average. And 2 other guys just have a great day. There's nothing I can do about that, but inevitably I end up starting at first and leaving in third. And a lot of people should think like third is still fantastic in that setting. But for me, I'd fallen short. I'd set this standard of I need to be first, and I fell short of that. Other people's standards was I needed to be first, and I fell short of that. And it's outside of sports too. There's school and clubs and extracurriculars. Those are kind of in this general realm that we can set standards for our grades. I have to have a certain grade or else, I'm not enough. I need to be in all these clubs or else I need all these extracurriculars. I need a certain SAT score. If I don't get into the right college, then I failed. And those are things that we fall short of a standard that we had set, that other people had set for us in a lot of ways. But even farther than just these surface level issues, a lot of the falling short comes in people's expectations of us. Our own expectation is, I should be better than this. I need to be better. And we set a bar and we don't meet it, and it crushes us. And we think, maybe I'm not that good. Maybe I'm not that great. Other people will say the same thing, where they say, I want you to live like this because this is my standard for a friend or a family member. And when we're human and we fall short of that, it crushes us because we feel like we're letting them down. We're always feeling like we're letting somebody down. It's heavy. It's weighty on our hearts. It makes us feel like we're drowning sometimes. Some of the good news about this story is that this isn't a story about Peter's failure. I know it may seem like it, initial reading, it seems like it is about Peter. But I'll remind you, this is a story about Jesus. This whole book is a story about Jesus. So what we have to see is that this isn't about Peter's failure. It's about Jesus' response to Peter. So one of the first things we see is Jesus walking on the water. That is his first declaration of and reminder of, look, I am who I say I am. I am God in the flesh, controlling nature, having power over it. He's establishing his divinity and his ability, reminding everybody in the boat, remember all these things that you've seen me do, in a really big exclamatory way by walking on water. It's a pretty huge deal. We can't even fathom how that works. We have no idea how that works because he's transcendent. He's beyond anything that we can imagine. So he does this big explosive view of his ability and his power. And the second thing that Jesus does is he shows his personability to Peter, his personal relationship and his care for him. They walk out on the water and Peter fails. He's a human. He falls short of what he thinks he should and what really he should do. And how does Jesus respond to that? It says he immediately reaches down and he grabs his arm and he pulls him out of the water. Now, like we said, Jesus is God. Jesus has authority. Especially as their teacher, he has the full right, if he wanted to, is to put him back in the boat and say, all right, you're done. I'm finished with you. You didn't meet this standard that everybody has set. And he had full right to do that, but he doesn't. How he responds is by pulling him up, reestablishing him as a part of the group. And this isn't to say that Peter goes on from here and is perfect or doesn't mess up. Peter continues to be an example of being a human. He falls short multiple times. And yet, at some point in the end, Jesus still establishes him as who the church is founded on. Who the first line of apostles comes right out of Peter preaching to people. And all through the rest of the New Testament is largely thanks to Peter being a great apostle, a human one nonetheless. And so this shows us that also, while Peter's story isn't about failure, neither is ours. our failures, while being a part of our life and our falling short being inevitable, this life and this story that we live is not about our failures, but it shows us Jesus' response to our failures in the same way that he did to Peter. This story shows us Jesus' heart for people who fall short, his heart for people who are low and need it, his heart for people who are suffering and hurting. His heart is full of compassion and kindness for those people, how he reaches down and pulls people out. That is who Jesus is. That is what his heart is about. He shows us how he feels towards us. And it's a heart full of compassion and kindness, gentleness, but also sternness and truth where it has to be said. So that's Jesus' heart. He wants us to trust him. He wants us to know him. And that's great news. So now, I'm going to pray, and then I'm going to ask a handful of questions for us. Jesus, I thank you for today. I thank you for the chance to hear about your heart for us as people who fall short, people who fail, people who set standards and can't meet them. Your heart for lost people, your heart for the world. God, may we see that you want to pull us out of the water, out of that drowning situation, and give us life, and have us trust you. Amen. We've got 3 questions. First one is, how do you respond to failure? The second one is, how does the world around you respond to your own failure and your own falling short? How do they talk to you about it? The last one is it hard to believe Jesus' heart for us? And why is it so hard to believe for us? Thanks, guys. We'll see you next week.